Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk to you about woodwind articulation in the first half of the 18th century and clear up a myth or two which have popped up in the modern classical music world of woodwind playing. So, are you ready for this? I initially started working on this video because I have had experiences both online and offline where I've heard from woodwind players that double tonguing was frequently used in Baroque music, and that there are many sources which explain how to double tongue. And after having done the research now, I can tell you that while the idea that double tonguing existed isn't wrong, per se, the many sources out there which touch on articulation are, for the most part, speaking about a codified variation in articulation, which to the casual browser might look like a recipe for double tonguing. Well, it's probably not that.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
The earliest treatises which speak about tonguing in woodwind playing come to us through the recorder player Silvestro Ganassi in 1535 and the cornetist Girolamo Dalla Casa 50 years later. In these treatises, we are shown that there are three basic ways to attack a note, each including a pairing of a syllable beginning with a harder consonant, followed by a syllable with a weaker consonant. When executed, the pair create a sort of inequality in performance, which mimics the characteristics of the different bow strokes in stringed instrumental performance.
Nature, it must live, it must breathe, like I do, like we all do. You know, it takes a breath and it goes.
When looking at the example here given in Dalla Casa's 1585 The True Way of Diminishing for all sorts of instruments, he gives us numerous examples of the pairing of te and re to show us the alternation in tonguing. But the note value is actually slow in the context of the rest of the book. These examples are set on the fusa, but both semi-fuse and fusele are present in the book. If what I just said just flew right over your head, there's a great video by Elam at Early Music Sources explaining mensural notation. I've linked it below. It'll take you directly to the relevant part of the video speaking about note values. Anyways, back to work. So what I'm pointing out here is that there are two faster note value divisions printed in that same book, yet Dalla Casa chooses the fusa for the demonstration on articulation. I would argue that this decision should point us to look at this pairing of syllables as a matter of articulation more generally, and not as a way to build a modern double-tonguing technique. Fast forward to 1707. Jacques Martin Hotteterre, probably the most influential transverse flute player of the Baroque period.
I'm French! Why do you think I have this outrageous accent, you silly king?
Publishes his principles of the transverse flute, recorder, and oboe. It's the first flute treatise that is used across Europe, and it's first published in Paris, but it gets reprinted in Amsterdam, and it's so popular that it's reprinted at least 8 times. It's also clear that flute players all over are at least aware of the treatise. In it, Hotteterre dedicates the good part of a chapter on articulation. He says, to make the flute easier to play and to avoid too much uniformity in tonguing, one varies them in different manners. There are two principal articulations, tu and ru. Tu is used the most on all larger note values, as well as a large portion of eighth notes. Repeated notes, as well as notes which are approached by a leap, are articulated with tu. If eighth notes, or faster note values, ascend or descend by step, then tu is interspersed with ru. That's essentially the basics. However, the author goes on for 5 more pages, codifying a complex set of rules which indicate how one should articulate certain types of passages or certain styles of music.
Lies! Lies, do you hear me? Give my creation lies!
It's important for us to understand that Hotteterre here is not giving us instructions on how to double tongue. He's creating a framework to, as he said, avoid too much uniformity. Uniformity in 18th century musical performance was something to be avoided, rather than embraced as we sometimes do today. The subtle changes in articulation, dynamics, as well as a certain tasteful flexibility in one's approach to rhythm were what made great performances at that time, and so many treatises attempt to explain or codify ways to develop these skills in a performer who is without a teacher. It's worth pointing out also that most, if not all, treatises from the 18th century mention the importance in the development of musical taste when explaining concepts which go beyond the notation itself. I think Johann Joachim Quantz says it's best when he writes that it is impossible to define fully in words either the difference between T or tu, D or ru, upon which a considerable part of the expression of the passions depends, or all of the different kinds of tongue strokes. Meanwhile, individual reflection will suffice to convince everyone that just as there are various shades between black and white, there is more than one intermediate degree between a firm and gentle tongue stroke. Now, one of the downsides of creating a system to develop understanding in a concept like this variation of articulation is that it can be hijacked, so to say, by pedants. Michel Corrette, in his 1740 method to learn to play the flute, speaks against Hotteterre's system of tus and rus. Today's virtuosi don't use these articulations anymore and look at them as an absurdity which only serves to tie up the student. Obviously, Corrette may have had a teacher who was a little bit too pedantic, but he does remind us that there is a limit to how much emphasis we should put on the sort of system that Hotteterre codifies. In his 1752 treatise on how to play the flute, Johann Joachim Quantz bases his chapter on articulation on that by Hotteterre, but further adds some very useful information. Quantz gives us pairings of syllables for the different contexts. The basic pair, T and D, are demonstrated to be used almost exactly as we have seen Hotteterre suggest. In passages of moderate speed and faster, Quantz recommends not to use this pairing as it makes all the notes alike, and he says to conform with good taste they must be a little unequal. So he gives us two more pairings, tiri, which is for moderate tempi, and diddle, which is for the fastest passages. Tiri is another elaboration on the Hotteterre system, but we learn a few more details about what the syllables represent. In this word, tiri, the accent falls on the second syllable. The T is short and the ri is long. So it's not just the front of the note that we are talking about when it comes to these syllables. It's not only an alternation of strong and weak, but of long and short. Quantz also gives us a very important detail when talking about this pairing. If the passage work must be played more quickly than tiri can be articulated, you must slur either the third and fourth notes or the first and second in a group of four. So, for the sake of expedience, it's okay to add our own slurs in music where there aren't any indicated. Moving on to Quantz's fastest pairing, diddle. This is as close to the modern double tongue as it gets. What he describes in the action of the tongue isn't exactly how I might describe double tonguing today. However, he later goes on to say that this technique can be used by bassoonists as well. The performer must first say D, and while on the tip of the tongue springs forward to the palate or reed, they quickly draw the middle portion of the tongue downward a little bit on both sides, away from the palate, so that wind is expelled on both sides obliquely between the teeth. This withdrawal of the tongue will then produce the stroke of the second syllable, diddle, but it can never be articulated without the preceding D. If you pronounce diddle quickly several times in a row, you will hear how it should sound better than I can express in writing. Diddle, 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 diddle. So a sort of double tonguing existed, but how was it used in context? Further into the chapter, he gives us a plethora of examples where the articulations we already know are interspersed with diddle. It's just another elaboration on the Hotteterre treatise, but now on steroids. If you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend taking a look through both Hotteterre and Quantz. Links are below. But don't get too bogged down in the details. The most important takeaway is that these systems attempt to ingrain an inherent inequality or variation of articulation in the reader. Uniformity is to be avoided. Here are the two first phrases of the second movement of the Telemann Sonata in F minor without continuo. I'll switch voices to keep the flow of the piece. In this example, I'm taking a slightly more microscopic approach to the articulation than I might in a concert hall setting, but the aim here is to give you an idea as to what those subtle changes in articulation might sound like on a bassoon of Quantz's time. Now, having listened to that, I'm sure you'll wonder exactly what all the fuss is all about. From the standpoint of the bassoon, it's actually quite difficult to hear the subtle differentiations in articulation, but they are there. It's important to keep in mind that quote from Quantz about how there are many shades between black and white. I began this video to clear up what I described as a myth around double tonguing in Baroque music. But it's more the application of double tonguing technique or just a modern style uniform single tonguing technique which I would discourage any performer to adopt. What I really want to discourage here is the practice, which is alive and well, I assure you, of using skills learned today or of applying an aesthetic or taste which is entirely original and then using certain lines of text to justify that approach as somehow authentic. We need a whole video or even a series of videos about authenticity in historical performance, but what I can say to you now is that it's a perfectly legitimate behavior to do something original to your taste and acknowledge it as such, but it's something else entirely if you claim that your performance is somehow authentic because you open the door to criticism on that particular performance based on a criteria which has nothing to do with the performance itself. If you try something new and it just falls flat on the stage, digging in and backing yourself up with program notes and CD liners isn't enough. I can tell you that the majority of the heated discussions I've witnessed as a professional in early music have taken place when a performer or director has cherry-picked bits of historical texts which, when combined together, seem to authorize a radical and often original performance. Those discussions would not have been able to take place, however, if those directors or performers simply told it like it was, that they were making their own original statement. Anyway, more on this another time. I hope that this video was helpful to you. If you would like to support this series, then please consider becoming a patron via Patreon. And don't forget, to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.